My name is Todd Bigelow. I'm a freelance photographer for the past 30 years based in Los Angeles, the founder of the Business of Photography Workshop, an adjunct professor of photography and photojournalism, and the author of a book on freelance business practices. This is a short video series where I address business practices that freelancers should be aware of. Hope you enjoy. Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. Thanks for dropping back by. Let's jump right back into it. I want to talk about trigger words today. These are words and/or phrases that show up in photo contracts, and I just want to address 5 of them. There's far more than that. I do include a little bit more extensive detail in my book, but let's jump into the ones that I think should definitely be at least in the top 10. So let's address the first 5 of them. Work for hire. I've talked about this pretty extensively, not only in this video series, but in, at conferences and where I speak and so forth and so on. So if you need to go into it further, please go back and watch the other videos. But work for hire, for all intents and purposes, is probably the most important and egregious term that you'll come across in a contract for freelance photographers. It means that you're going to give up the copyright to your work. And that's a very, very important and impactful thing to do if you are a freelance photographer, for reasons that, again, I go into in the other videos that I've talked about work for hire. But that should be, anytime you see work for hire or work made for hire, or any version of that, that should be a big time indicator for you to stop, really think about whether or not you want to agree to that contract before you go for it, because it will have very long-term implications on what you can or can't do with your work. If you give up the copyright, you're giving up ownership of your work. Okay, so first and foremost, for trigger words, pay attention to work for hire or work made for hire if it shows up in your photo contract, which it does quite often. Second, perpetual or in perpetuity. Okay, this essentially means forever. And oftentimes you will see it in relation to perpetual use by subsidiaries, affiliates, and assignees and partners. Okay, that's very extensive use of your photographs that you're giving up forever. That's what perpetual means. It will show up in your photo contract. It can be in various forms. It can be grouped with other terms, like I said, subsidiaries, affiliates, partners, assignees. That essentially means you are providing to the client that is hiring you forever use, perpetual use of your images, and oftentimes if it's accompanied by affiliates and assignees and partners and so forth, anybody that they assign those images to will also have perpetual or forever use. So be very cautious with that as well. Here's a good trigger word or trigger clause, original context. If you do not see it in your photo contracts, try to get it in there, especially with in perpetuity or perpetual. So here's what I mean. If I see perpetual and I don't see in original context, I will almost always ask for that to be added. And it does get added quite often, to be honest with you. Because what that does is now it limits the scope of perpetual. So perpetual in original context means that your client can use whatever work you're supplying forever in that original context. So if it's a story that goes on a website or in a magazine, or maybe it's a company that's hiring you to shoot some images for a brochure, that brochure would be the original context. The story that goes up on the website would be the original context. And anything beyond that, your client now will be coming back to you and saying, hey, we use these images originally in this story, but we'd like to use some of them again for another story. And they're going to request permission from you, and more than likely pay a licensing fee. It might be just a modest fee, but that's fine. That's fair, and that's how it really should work. So look for original context, because that's a good way to limit the scope of perpetual. Brand use. That is a term that first appeared in contracts for me in 2016 with the Sports Illustrated Time Inc. photo contract. It was a major change, and I've seen it in several other contracts. So prior to that 2016 contract with Sports Illustrated, when I had been doing work for many years for the magazine and Time and People and others under the Time Inc. umbrella, you were hired by that particular magazine. So Sports Illustrated would hire me. I'd do a shoot for Sports Illustrated. Sports Illustrated would use the images, and any other use beyond that use in the Sports Illustrated magazine, they would pay me a nominal licensing fee like they would my colleagues, and we'd earn extra revenue for that. Sports Illustrated has, offshoots. Sports Illustrated for Kids. They produce, year-end publications and special editions and all sorts of other things that are associated with Sports Illustrated. When the new contract came out, we started to see, my colleagues and I, we saw in that contract, and I've seen in others now, the term brand use. And what that refers to is you're now not working for the particular brand magazine, you're working for the brand, which is essentially a corporation. So what they would say is the assigning brand gets full use of your images forever with no additional fees and 99.9% of the time. Okay, so what that means now is you're no longer shooting just for that one publication. Again, let's just take Sports Illustrated, although, like I said, it's popped up in other contracts. If you now do a shoot for Sports Illustrated, you're not shooting for that publication. You're shooting for the brand, and the brand gets a use. And that brand is anything with the name, trademark, or logo associated with it. That's how it's stipulated in the contract. So, and Sports Illustrated, the brand, has gone into services and products. So your images that you shoot could, by contract, they would have the legal right to use them to promote a product, to promote a service, and you would get no additional fees for that. And as we know, when you get into marketing and advertising use of an image, those are good licensing fees that you're giving up by allowing a brand use of something. And those of us that have been around long enough also understand quite clearly that working for a publication is an editorial rate. Working for a corporation is a corporate rate, and they're quite different. Corporate fees are usually, quite a bit higher. So by allowing for brand use, you're essentially doing a corporate job. Although these contracts want to pay you typically like an editorial job. So be very careful of brand use and understand what that means. Very, very extensive rights for a company to use the images without any additional pay. And finally, for the sake of this video, if accepted, okay? Those are two words, a short term that appears in quite a bit of photo contracts, and it's oftentimes glossed over just because it doesn't jump out. But if accepted means that the client, if they accept your work that you've been hired to do, will pay you. That is not how it works in the business world. Even if it's the first time you're being hired for a job, the creative director, the photo editor, they, of course, are taking a little bit of a risk by hiring you if they haven't worked with you before. But they've done their research. They've looked at your portfolio. They've looked at your work. Perhaps they've looked at your bio and seen who else you've worked for. Perhaps they've met with you. And they're going to assign you a job. And hopefully you're going to do a good job on that, because if you do a good job, they're going to assign you other work and they're going to recommend you to their colleagues. That's how freelancing works. Now, it does not work and should not work in the way that they're going to take a risk on you. And if you do a good job and if they accept the images, which is what the term usually says in the contract, then they'll pay you. No, they should pay you whether or not you do a good job in their eyes. We've all, not done 100% on a shoot before, and perhaps you lose a client, or perhaps, it slows down with that client. That's unfortunate, but that's the way the world works. It works that way for a restaurant. You don't get to go in and sit down and eat and decide afterwards that wasn't that good of a meal and you don't really accept it, so therefore you're only going to pay a portion of the bill, or you won't pay the bill at all. The same with if you get a haircut. If you go to a new barber or new stylist for the first time, you don't get to go in there, and it's a risk. You're taking a risk. It's the first time that you're using this stylist, and you go in and they do a job, and perhaps you're not really happy with it. Perhaps they didn't get the color just right or the cut just right. You don't get a chance to accept it or not accept it and then choose whether or not to pay for it. The repercussions for the stylist, if they didn't meet your expectations, is you're not going to go back and you're not going to recommend them. So I always recommend that you try to negotiate out the if accepted clause if you see it in there, okay? Because that's only fair. Hope that helps. Those are just 5 trigger words, trigger terms. There are more, but go ahead and pay attention to those, and it should help you get a general idea of what rights and terms are being asked of you in a photo contract. Okay, thanks for stopping by. See you again soon.